Good afternoon. I'm John Hilbold, Director of Lectures and Seminars here at the Heritage Foundation, and it's my privilege to welcome everyone to Heritage and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind to check that one last time that cell phones have been turned off. It will be appreciated as we begin our program. We will post this event on our Heritage homepage within 24 hours for your future reference as well. Hosting our discussion this afternoon initially is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He also was the Council's Senior Country Director for American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. He has served on the Senior Republican Professional Staff for a ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, as well as advised Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Walter Lohman. Walter?
Ramadan Mabruk. Thank you for joining us. It's really great to see such a big crowd for Bangladesh. You know, we didn't entirely expect it, but it shows you that there's a big market for doing more on Bangladesh. In fact, I don't think there's enough done on such an important country in this town. I think we should all, after this, work together to that end, to not let it end here. You know, it's so key to South Asia's politics and its economy. It's an important node in the global economy as well, especially in the garment sector. And I suspect we'll be talking a lot about that today, that is specifically the garment sector, in light of the recent events in Bangladesh and what, in my opinion, is a misguided response from the Obama administration with respect to GSP benefits. We also come together, I was talking to some friends beforehand that I wish we had planned this to coincide with the Bangladesh Worker Safety Initiative that was announced this morning. It would prove, as Ed Gresser said, it would prove that Heritage really does rule the world. But we didn't plan it. It's a good fortuitous circumstance, though, to be here the same day that the initiative has been launched, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well, too. I don't want to give short shrift to the political security issues. We're going to talk about those, and Lisa's going to make some introductions. Alyssa Ayers, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Central Asia, is going to be here for that later, and Lisa will give her a proper introduction. But I wanted to take a minute at the outset just to say how much I appreciate her doing this. Heritage has a little bit of an edge to it, and as a result, we don't get as many people from State Department and administration as maybe we could here. And I really appreciate Alyssa taking the risk and being here for a good cause today. So we'll hear more from her later. The title of the program is Moving Bangladesh to a Better Future. It's noteworthy, I think, that we would get such a diverse group of commentators in that cause. And I think you'll notice as we go through the panels how diverse they are. I think in the end it'll also be remarkable that there's a good deal of agreement on how we do move forward. I think we probably will come to that conclusion, and we have some disagreements that'll be good and fun also. So with that, let me make a very special introduction. We're very honored to have with us Bangladesh's ambassador to the United States, Akramul Kader. He has been serving here as ambassador from Bangladesh since November 2009. He's concurrently Bangladesh's ambassador to Mexico and Colombia. He's a very accomplished career diplomat with the rank of state minister. Mr. Kadir, Ambassador Kadir, has previously served as Bangladesh's High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador to Thailand, and Permanent Representative to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. I could go on and on through your illustrious career, but that would leave less time for us to hear from you. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Ambassador, and you can get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, for the fantastic introduction of myself. And a big introduction for a small man. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I thank the Heritage Foundation for holding this event and giving us an opportunity to hear from experts and practitioners dwelling on Bangladesh. I seriously hope that the two panels that we're having today would help us do an important stock-taking and shed light on Bangladesh's immediate development journey. I would like to touch upon only a few aspects pertaining to Bangladesh's politics and economy, which I'm sure I shall have an opportunity to draw further inputs from the deliberations of our distinguished panelists. Some key accomplishments in the last 2 decades have earned Bangladesh accolades. From a predominantly agrarian society marked by hunger and extreme poverty, presently the agriculture sector's contribution in Bangladesh's GDP has come down to just 18%. Our service sector now accounts for 52% of the economy, and this is burgeoning. Less than 1/5 of the Bangladeshi people now fall under the absolutely poor category as defined by the World Bank, that is, people earning less than $1.25 per day. According to a 2010 survey, in 1 decade leading to that year, prevalence of poverty in Bangladesh came down annually at an average rate of 2.47%. Bangladesh's economic run cannot be measured just by coining some key economic figures. It is also critical to ascertain that the dividends of development have reached the economic upper class. Eradicating social disparity and ensuring justice are among the key goals that our forefathers passionately articulated during the dreamy days of our independence. Some visible changes have taken place in our national life since. From hardly much enrollment of female students among Bangladesh's first generation of primary and secondary schoolgoers, we can now celebrate a near gender parity at most of our classrooms. We aim to bring down the rate of school dropouts to 0 and have gender parity at even the highest tier of education. According to the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, participation of female labor force in Bangladesh economy jumped up to 36% in 2010 from 8% in 1983-84. Since independence, Bangladesh never suffered an economic growth, even negative economic growth. Even a persistent global economic slump could not have a drastic negative impact on its economy, as happened in many parts of the developing world recently. Without much foreign assistance, Bangladesh has already met 9 out of 11 MDG targets, 2 years ahead of 2015 deadline, which include poverty reduction, attainment of gender parity at primary and secondary level education, and reduction in prevalence of malaria and mortality rate under the age of 5. I must mention here that at the time of setting MDG targets, the rich countries committed to provide 0.7% of their GNI to the LDCs, but in reality, they gave only 0.29 of their gross national income. Were developed nations to disburse the meager 0.7% of their GNI, countries like Bangladesh would be in a much better position to achieve the remaining goals. Garments and overseas employment that practically constitute the backbone of Bangladesh's foreign economic relations have retained growth trend despite fresh challenges. Growth rates in the garment sector averaged around 15% during the last 4 years. McKinsey and Company forecast that the volume of Bangladesh's garment export would double within the next 7-8 years to $45 billion. A test facing the next generation of Bangladeshi entrepreneurs is how to diversify trade in terms of both foreign market and export basket. Shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals, light engineering, ICT are reckoned as emerging sectors that can dramatically change Bangladesh's business profile if quality investments come in. Last year, Bangladeshi IT service companies could earn over $70 million. Now over 80% of Bangladesh's 160 million people possesses at least one mobile phone set, compared to 10% in neighboring Burma. 97% of Bangladesh's local medicine needs is met locally. Pharmaceutical items are currently exported to more than 90 countries. We are waiting for the US FDA's final concurrence to enter the USA. Bangladesh is yet to take the full advantage of the WTO provision, allowing the least developed countries to produce medicine through reverse engineering and export globally. Bangladeshi shipbuilders capable of making 10,000 deadweight ton ships hold the potential to earn $2 billion worth within the next 5 years. Obviously, our business journey is not without jolts, some quite painful. For a while, our trade ties with the USA have gained importance as a source of everyday policy debate and think tank blog postings. Thanks to our good friends at the AFL-CIO, our school kids are not anymore the slow learners of the abbreviations and substance of a vital trade policy toolkit called GSP. The message has been spread to the most commoners. Fire accident at Tazreen Garments last November and the building collapse in Sawar are two of the deadliest incidents in our brief manufacturing history. Like the victims' families, the entire nation would need a long time to recover from this shock. With its limited resources, the government did its best to compensate the victims' families and drastically overhaul factory safety and security. The formation of a high-powered cabinet committee to look after the occupational safety issues in just one single sector, garments, in fact, predated the Sawar tragedy. The Bangladesh Garments Manufacturers and Exporters Association, or BGMEA, has directed all its members to furnish factory inspection reports detailing structural and electrical safety design certified by professionals. Garments found to be located in vulnerable structures will be given a time-bound corrective action plan. The BGMEA has categorically stated that in case of failure of the non-compliant factories to properly follow the safety code, membership would be suspended or cancelled. Already they have suspended membership of 19 factories. The strength of the Department of Inspection for factories and establishments has been increased so that it can set up the required number of special inspection teams who can undertake a comprehensive inspection of factories very soon. Last May, the International Labour Organization facilitated the signing of a government employee-owner tripartite agreement to work together on factory safety and labour welfare. Excuse me. Our 2006 labour law is expected to be amended in the current session of the Parliament so that the ILO can implement its Better Work program. The US Embassy in Dhaka is in consultation with Bangladesh's largest NGO, BRAC, to draw up a unit of 200 independent factory inspectors who would be able to monitor factory safety and report independently. Bangladesh government has welcomed this idea and expressed willingness to extend all necessary support for implementing this program. We envisage that within a few years, around 1,000 garment factories would be relocated in the proposed 532-acre garments village. The European retailers have signed an agreement to finance and implement time-bound programs for factory safety. Some of the US retailers have joined this initiative. The 17 leading North American retail brands and 6 associations have worked out a mechanism to act together. Senators George Michel and Olympia Snow led an initiative of the US retailers named the Alliance for Bangladesh Workers' Safety, the details of which have been developed through stakeholders dialogue organized by the Bipartisan Policy Center. An action plan was released this morning. It is beyond my capacity to comment if the GSP suspension is exactly what Bangladesh needed at this moment. Firstly, Bangladesh's garments trade is not covered by the US GSP. unlike the benefits offered to Bangladesh in other OECD markets. Secondly, the beneficiaries of the US GSP in Bangladesh, the rural farmers, are completely unrelated to garments. Thirdly, in any case, Bangladesh expressed its willingness to work with all its trading partners for improving factory conditions, both in the short term and long-term contexts. Finally, and most ironically, the worst sufferers of a GSP suspension would be none other than the workers. Closure of factories that employ millions of workers with no other place to go can, in the worst case scenario, result in a social catastrophe. Now the relatively unsavory portion of my remark which relates to politics and security. Our people liberated their motherland through a bloody war in the hopes of materializing some definite principles and norms in the nation's life. Even when seen through the prism of today's Bangladesh, those are not lofty. Unfortunately, the nation's democratic headway and political institution building process succumbed to regressive courses time and again, leading prompted by military and quasi-military interventions. After the brutal assassination of our founding father, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the power that we made decades-long propaganda to qualify the most plain and simple acts of killing as revolution. After Bangabandhu, the four national leaders were gunned down inside their prison cells. Self-confessed killers were rewarded for their, quote, heroic deeds, unquote. And they went as far as getting elected to the parliament and contesting presidential elections. The constitution was cleaned of secular provisions. Jamaat-e-Islam, a communal political party banned for destructive activities during the War of Liberation, was allowed to be back in the old business. Persistent, undemocratic regimes only could outbid each other in terms of allowing them further space with a view to consolidating own footing. The present government of Bangladesh, led by Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, assumed office after receiving a massive popular mandate. Since assumption of office, the government has undertaken a number of innovative, constructive, and proactive initiatives in both domestic and international fronts. Domestically, the government has put its primary focus on restoring secular characteristics of the Constitution, ensuring independence of judiciary, enacting Rights to Information Act, establishment of Independent Human Rights Commission, strengthening Election Commission, digitization of the bureaucratic institutions, showing zero tolerance to religious extremism, ensuring universal health facilities for the citizens, and enacting a new education policy to streamline the curricula of the primary and secondary levels of general, madrasa, and vocational education institutes. Internationally, we have tried through our foreign policy apparatus to actively contribute to the regional and international level and to the institutional policy making and thematic work of the UN. Notable among these are commitment to international peace and security through sustained contribution to UN peacekeeping operations, macroeconomic stability, poverty alleviation, literacy, women's empowerment, enhanced maternal and child health care, etc. This resulted in gaining greater international confidence as a pluralist, modernizing, functioning democracy, creating basic conditions that help achieve socio-economic objectives. The international community in turn has shown confidence in us by electing nominees of the present government in international bodies such as ECOSOC, Human Rights Commission, UNDP Executive Board, CEDAW, and the ITU Council. The US Congress in March 2009 adopted unanimously a bill lauding the return of democracy to Bangladesh. Trying the war criminals was one of the key electoral pledges of the present government. When the process of a long overdue justice was initiated, as anticipated, Jamaat's militant face resurfaced. Neither the politically reluctant people of Bangladesh nor the present government is of the view that there is any scope of renegotiation on this issue. When justice itself is its reward, calculation of political cost is bound to remain a futile exercise. Hifazat-e-Islam, a platform of Qaumi Madrasa students and clerics, has had sympathy from the opposition political parties in their self-defined mission of protecting Islam. It beggars another interpretation how trial of criminals can undermine a religion, Islam or any other religion, or why medieval age ideas need to be applied in a forward-leaning modern nation. The thing at issue in our national politics is the format of the government that will be presiding over the general elections during early next year. I believe it would be less difficult an exercise to pore over how the current election cycle season fares vis-a-vis the terminal days of 3 previous elected administrations. There is understandably less novelty in the frequency of hartals as a political weapon. Whoever political party might call this, the fact remains this particular activity has lost appeal with the people. The earlier the major political parties would come to their senses and read their constituencies' mindset, the better it is for the rest of the nation. I have even found some sarcastically talking of hartal that it adds to our traffic efficiency. Early resignation of a democratically elected government as a cliché looks so old-fashioned that even the opposition hardliners are shy of demanding this lately. Victory of opposition political parties in the recent city corporation elections has added to the tally of fair and credible elections held under a political government. Never in the past, stakeholders in Bangladesh politics had more inclusive post-election images as happened a few days ago. It may not be a case of over-optimism to expect that the national level elections can also produce similar images. That expectation has some logic when the same group of voters would make the constituency of the general elections. If the frontline leaders cannot have that degree of trust in each other, voters would certainly do their part. The main opposition party's return to the parliament after a long hiatus will mean a lot to the people only when certain degree of good faith is demonstrated in purpose and constructive ideas are floated in the floor. Globally, the discussion on security has undergone a paradigm shift. Realignment of security sector resources that are extremely limited is a need of the day. I hope our colleagues from the DoD would agree that a host of threats originate from non-traditional and non-military sources: food security, water security, energy security, conservation of environment, protection against natural calamities are the issues that we need to deal on a daily basis. Low-lying, less developed countries such as Bangladesh have been put in the face of climate change hazards where their names were never on the offenders list. The most critical issue is that until the industrial nations own up their historical responsibility, a vast plain of the low-lying countries, including that of Bangladesh, is on ocean's grab. Bangladesh is the current chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. With its most modest resources, Bangladesh has mobilized a climate change resilience fund. Issues relating to human security and coping with the challenges of global climate change have thankfully featured in Bangladesh US talks at various levels. Bangladesh features in all development initiatives of the Obama administration, including the Climate Change Initiative. Youth bulge, technology, social media, civil society activism, grassroots NGO activism, women empowerment, overseas employment, anthropological homogeneity, secular and liberal outlook all together define Bangladesh. The idea of Bangladesh is inherently monolithic, what several forces contested in the past with a very limited result. People resisted, sought justice, and corrected as much as a particular juncture of history could permit. I think Heritage's choice of the title for today's colloquium, Toward a Better Future, cannot be more befitting and thought-provoking. Our resilient people are far from being exhausted with their endeavor and far from reaching the culmination point of prospects. Thankfully, that is also our focus today. I thank you all for your attention.
Well, that was an excellent way to start. Could I invite our panelists to come up and we'll get started with the first panel. I know Dr. Kudus has a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm kind of looking for our IT guys to get us working here. Delete. Good. It'll come up in a moment. Let me, while we're waiting, I'll just make an introduction of all of our panelists, and then we can go through them one at a time. Munir Kudus is Dean of the College of Business at Prairie View A&M University and Professor of Economics. He's also Executive Director of the Small Business Development Center and the Center for International Business Education at Prairie View. His PhD is in economics from Vanderbilt University. As most of our distinguished guests, the rest of the bio is much too long for me to go through the whole thing, but trust me, it's quite an impressive career already at this early stage of his career. Then we'll turn to Shamarukh Mohuddin. She is Executive Director of the U.S. Bangladesh Advisory Council, where she leads the organization's programs, operations, and policy advocacy initiatives. Prior to joining USBAC, Ms. Mohuddin served as director at the Trade, Aid, and Security Coalition and the Business Council for Global Development, where she managed policy development and programs. She has a master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins University. Last, batting cleanup here is usually our own staff bats cleanup, but Ed Gresser is the next best thing to our own staff. Ed is a longtime friend of mine personally, and he has been on Heritage Stage occasionally as well. He's director of the Progressive Economy Project at Global Works Foundation. He's also a senior advisor at Fontime International, LLC. Ed's bio says he is, quote, one of the country's best known and most influential trade policy scholars, unquote. Bios always sound really good, but I have to say that's an absolutely true statement. I can attest to that description of Ed. He's quite influential on trade policy and has influenced quite a number of people in this town, especially on his side of the aisle. Ed's government service has included stints at USTR and staffed Senator Max Baucus, which is where I first met him. He holds an MA from Columbia University. At the outset, I joked a little bit about Alyssa and the risk that she's taking coming to Heritage Foundation. I just want you to know I have some skin in this game too. At least two of these folks are Democrats, and serious Democrats at that. And maybe worse, they have the word progressive sprinkled throughout their bios. So I think we're all in this together. Let me turn it over to you, Munir, and get us started.
Thank you, Walter. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Ambassador Kader for the invitation and the Heritage Foundation for putting this program together. I've known of the Heritage for many years as a think tank that does serious research, but this is my first opportunity to participate in the program. I'm delighted to be here. Anytime you can get away from Texas, Houston, Texas in summer is a good thing.
But you came here.
As was noted, today is also the first or the second day of the month of Ramadan. So Ramadan Mubarak to those who are fasting. Roughly it means happy fasting. I've been asked to speak on Bangladesh economy with particular emphasis on the garment export sector of Bangladesh, which has been in the news a lot, as all of you know. I believe the overall theme of this program, Moving Bangladesh to a Better Future, is very appropriate and very timely. I plan to share a few facts and figures, a little bit of history and analysis, and then I'm looking forward to questions. And there's very limited time, so I'm going to be able to address maybe 2 or 3 of these slides. I have about 16 slides, but I'll be happy to share any of these if you are interested. Let me start with the Bangladesh economy. As Ambassador Kadir mentioned, that Bangladesh as an independent country came into existence on December 16, 1971, 42 years ago. It was a very difficult, tumultuous circumstances under which Bangladesh was born. The circumstances were so difficult, there was so much destruction and disruption, that very few people were optimistic about the economic future of the new country, the new nation. Henry Kissinger can be excused for making the comment that is going to be another international basket case. Fast forward 42 years later, there's much to be proud of, as Bangladeshis are, about the achievements of the country. There was a difficult initial period. There was the famine of 1974, lest we forget. 1.5 million people, according to some estimates, lost their lives. But today, as we stand in 2013, there's much to be proud of about the achievements of Bangladesh. You have to remember that you're talking about the 7th largest nation in the world, 160 million people squeezed in an area the size of the state of Iowa, where there are 3 million people. So that gives some idea about the scope of the challenge and the excitement of these achievements that Bangladesh has been able to achieve. I put some figures on this table to give you some idea about the size of the economy. The ambassador has spoken about some of these to begin with. These are from the CIA fact book on Bangladesh. The GDP is around $118 billion, much smaller than neighboring India, by a factor of perhaps 15, about half the size of Pakistan and twice the size of Sri Lanka. The GDP per capita, per person, is about $780 per year. The middle income status, GDP per person, if you take the GDP and divide it by the number of people, that's around $1,035. So Bangladesh is about $250 short of achieving the middle income status. What you have here is a GDP per capita that's adjusted for purchasing power. And that, of course, is 3 times higher because of the low cost of labor in Bangladesh. The GDP growth rate, which is the holy grail for the economist as they look at the economy to see its performance, has done pretty well. Over the last 20 years, Bangladesh has grown about 5% per year in a very consistent way. So that has done much for the economy. Now, many people say that you should not judge the performance of the economy just by looking at the GDP. So Amartya Sen and Mahbubul Haq came up with a composite index of the measure of the economy in terms of how is it benefiting all of the population. So instead of just looking at income, you're looking at health care, you're looking at education and some of the other measures. This is called the Human Development Index, HDI, and it's put up by the UNDP every year since 1992. On this count, Bangladesh has done much better, remarkably well. Amartya Sen has been saying in public that Bangladesh HDI performance has been better than that of India on a number of counts. The ambassador already mentioned the Millennium Development Goals. Bangladesh has achieved several of the goals ahead of the target date. One of the most important goals being reducing extreme poverty by 1/2. And so the poverty rate has fallen from 50% to about 30% more recently, 2 years ahead of the target. Life expectancy has risen from 59 to 69 years, a 10 years increase, and this holds for the rich and for the poor. The infant mortality rate has fallen from 97 to 37, a 70% improvement. The fertility rate has come down from 6.3 to 2.3 only in 4 decades. The literacy rate for females is up from 38% to 77%, above both India and neighboring Pakistan. And the gender gap, especially in the primary education, has been completely eliminated. These achievements have been noticed. In fact, The Economist, in a recent issue, November 2012, said that over the past 20 years, Bangladesh has made some of the biggest gains in the basic condition of people's lives ever seen anywhere in the world history. So Bangladesh has received recognition for these gains. Now, there are some challenges. And as an economist, I would talk about economic challenges, but the biggest challenge happens to be political. It's the challenge of governance. The 2 major political parties, the Awami League and the BNP, have not been able to work together in the parliament. To be sure that Bangladesh has had democracy for about 20 years now. 4 times governments have changed in democratic elections. But the inability to work in the parliament is a negative, and that somehow we have to overcome. Another challenge would be to preserve the gains that have been made in the garment sector and in exports, and to build on these for the future. That's a big challenge. A third challenge, I would say, is the infrastructure. Dhaka happens to be one of the most polluted and most congested cities in the world today, and that cannot continue. Bangladesh needs a 21st century infrastructure for 21st century economic development. One has to mention poverty. The rate of poverty is below 30% now, but still you're talking about 45 to 50 million people. That's a large group of people, and somehow you have to reach that group in the coming years. And finally, as a long-term challenge, you have the climate impact. As a low-lying delta, Bangladesh is going to be one of the first big nations that is going to be impacted as the sea levels rise. So those are some of the challenges. Now, I don't know how much time I have, but I want to talk.
Sure, take a couple more minutes.
A couple of minutes to talk about the garment export industry. I have been a student of this industry for a number of years. In 1992, I had a fellowship from the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, AIBS, and I spent a year in Bangladesh collecting data on the garment sector. At that time, it was a $3 billion, $2 billion export industry, but still it was an exciting sector to study. I must have visited about 50 factories all over the country, in Dhaka, Chittagong, and other places, met entrepreneurs, managers, workers, met the policymakers, the Chamber of Commerce called the BGMEA. And the book came out in 2000. It's called Entrepreneurs and Economic Development, The Remarkable Story of Garment Exports from Bangladesh. By the way, it's still available on Amazon.com. Just a plug-in. But the industry has been well researched. In 2004, another book came out by Hafiz Siddiqui. And more recently, I reviewed a book by Sanchita Saxena. She's at Berkeley. And the book talks about all the alliances that are taking place, something that you don't see in the newspapers, but she speaks of the alliances between labor and management, partnerships between the different groups, which are all for the positive. So if you look at some of the statistics, here's a little bit of history of the garment sector. It started off in the late 1970s. One of the striking features of the garment industry in Bangladesh is that early on, it caught the attention of foreign investors, more specifically South Koreans. As you know that at that time, the global garment trade was kind of managed by something called MFA, the multi-fiber arrangement, which went into effect in 1975 and was existed for about 30 years. It went away in 2005. So South Korea was a major garment exporter, clothing exporter, and Daewoo was a big player. And as it hit its own quota, it was looking for other places to produce and manufacture clothing, and it came to Bangladesh. There was an agreement with a company called Desh, and about 130 supervisors from Desh spent 6 months in Busan in South Korea getting trained. So this is striking. These people came back to Bangladesh, and pretty soon they left the company and started their own small businesses, so startups, and from there on it grew like a mushroom. In the 1980s, you had a consolidation of the industry. It was now a big sector and an industry. And in 1982, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association, BGME, was established. Fortunately, this happens to be a single group. There have been a lot of internal political turmoil, but they have stayed together. There's also a major group called BKMEA, Bangladesh Knitwear Manufacturers and Exporters Association, which has about 2,000 members today. That's more recent. But you know that in the garment industry, basically you have the woven clothes and you have the knitwear. In 1985, there was a big crisis. For the first time, quotas were imposed on Bangladesh, not just by the United States, but also by England, by France, by Canada. About half the factories closed. It was a major crisis. Floods took place in 1988, a lot of disruption. In the 1990s, you had some serious political instability. The journal strike or the hartals affects the industry pretty badly because it is very tightly timed, scheduled industry. And you have to be able to produce, manufacture, and deliver on time. And then you had the East Asian economic crisis, and you had the natural disasters. Come to the last decade, the MFA was phased out in the year 2005. There was a major threat. It was felt that Bangladesh is going to suffer from China taking over the global trade, which happened. But Bangladesh, fortunately, continued to surge in the garment business. And in 2010, it was declared by World Trade Organization as the second largest garment exporter in the world. And then, of course, came the twin tragedies. The Tazreen factory fire in November 2012 that killed 112 garment workers. And then the Rana Plaza collapse of the building that killed 1,132 garment workers. I think that's the correct figure. And so these came back to back and attracted a lot of negative global media attention. This slide speaks of the number of garment factories, gives you some idea. We have more than 5,000 factories today. Employment of the workers, about 4 million workers, mostly women, about 79–80% are women. The garment exports is close to $20 billion, which happens to be about 78–80% of the total exports in the industry. The major markets remain the United States, about 24% comes to the US markets. And the next biggest market is Germany, followed by England and France. So the European Union as a bloc is the biggest market for Bangladeshi exports. Unlike the United States, in Europe, Bangladesh garments does enjoy the GSP preferences. So in terms of the economic impact, it has been a source of GDP growth. It has been a source for employment for a large number of the labor force, about 7% of the entire labor force of 74 million people, and about 60% of the formal labor force is employed in the garment industry. The industry is about 13% of the GDP. In terms of social impact, women's empowerment must be one of the first that is mentioned. I think my time is up, so let me just conclude here by saying a few things. The first thing I want to say is that the economy of Bangladesh and the garment sector, their destiny is now very closely linked together. What is good for the garment industry is good for Bangladesh, and what is not good for the garment industry is not good for the country. Both Bangladesh and the garment industry have much to celebrate, much to be proud of. The garment industry is now a major player on the world trade scene. No one had imagined this is going to happen 10, 20 years ago. But having said that, we can say that this is the best of times and the worst of times for the industry and for the country. You are at a crossroads. If the industry leaders bury their head in the sand and think this is business as usual, I think it is going to be very tragic. There's going to be stagnation, perhaps even decline. If they are proactive, if they take the message that this is serious situation, the eye of the world is focused on Bangladesh garments and on Bangladesh today. And if they rise up to the occasion, as they have done so many times in the past, and introduce the reforms that need to be introduced in terms of increasing the minimum wage, improving workers' safety conditions, improving the structural safety of the buildings, enabling workers to form unions and collective bargaining. If some of those reforms are undertaken by the government, by the BGMEA, and for the workers to understand that the way forward is not through hostility and violence, but through partnership with the management, then I think the sky is the limit. At the rate at which the garment industry has grown in the past, sometimes 24% year after year, and more recently 10 to 15%. It could very well double in the next 5 to 7 years to $40 billion, and it could double again to $80 billion. When we were writing the book, the garment industry in China was about $24 billion. Today it is at $120 billion. So the global garment business is going to grow to about $600 billion over the next 10 years. And Bangladesh can easily capture 10% more of this business. The bigger picture is that out of the last billion people on this world who are in poverty, about 50 million are in Bangladesh. So if people in this room are serious about dealing a blow to global poverty, this is a low-hanging fruit. We can easily bring this 50 million people out of poverty by supporting exports in Bangladesh and supporting the garment business. And so my appeal is, perhaps the GSP was necessary, the suspension was necessary to send a signal, but now that the signal has been sent, I think very quickly the US government should work with Bangladesh for a blueprint on how these benefits can be given back, and also a big carrot. And the carrot would be that if you're able to take care of these issues, then the clothing industry, the clothing export would be added to the preferences, to the GSP, as has been done in Europe. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Personally, I had never heard that comparison to Iowa. That's a really eye-opener, to think of it that way. Let me turn it over to you, please.
Thank you, Walter. My name is Shamaruk Mohiuddin again, with the U.S. Bangladesh Advisory Council, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation and Walter for hosting me. I won't go too much into detail about Bangladesh's development challenges and prospects. I think that those have been very, very well covered. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the plan unveiled this morning by the North American retailers, because it's so current and a lot of people are talking about it now, given everything that's been going on over the past 2 months. And also a little bit about how U.S. trade policy can play a bigger role in promoting labor standards in the garment industry beyond this plan that's just been released. Just to give also a brief overview of U.S.-Bangladesh trade, sort of the trade profile. Currently, Bangladesh is the U.S.'s 57th largest trading partner, so still pretty small. The U.S. exports about 1.1 billion worth of goods to Bangladesh and imports about 5.1 billion annually. So the trade deficit is quite significant, but U.S. exports to Bangladesh are actually growing at a very remarkable rate, rising by over 90% year by year over the last 2 years. Some of the top U.S. exports include cotton, yarn, fabric, aircraft machinery, iron and steel products. And as you know, Bangladesh mostly exports garments. The garment growth to the U.S. market hasn't been sort of as staggering over the last few years, actually. Total Bangladesh exports rose a little bit last year, about 11%. This is the total to the world. We believe that commercial opportunities between the two countries could be expanded much more. There are a few stumbling blocks, as you heard Dr. Kudus mention, the compliance issues and the tariff issues with regard to garments has been a big problem with expanding trade. But also, Bangladesh has certain restrictions with regard to foreign investment, so those have stood in the way. Bangladesh hasn't signed the Trade and Investment Framework and Cooperation Agreement, which is sort of a precursor to an FTA, sort of. It's been sort of called a TICFA because they wanted to add cooperation to the agreement. But what it is a forum for dialogue between the two countries. And at USBSC, we do feel that there is a need for a regular forum for dialogue on trade issues. So right now, the two countries are working on hammering out sort of the details of the TICFA, and hopefully it'll be signed. And we'll also provide sort of a venue for discussing the labor and garment issues. I'll let Ed expand much more on sort of U.S. trade policy because he's sort of the expert on that. I've learned a lot about sort of trade policy towards the least developed countries from Ed, in fact. So just a quick tidbit about U.S. trade policy towards LDCs. It provides duty-free, quota-free market access to the African LDCs, and including the non-LDC African countries too within the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And there's also the Caribbean Basin Initiative that includes some of the LDCs. It's actually just the Asian LDCs that do get left out of these trade preference programs. So Bangladesh, Cambodia, some of the Asian LDCs in the Pacific, a few other countries, I believe including Pakistan, does not get duty-free. So we believe that this is fundamentally sort of an unfair playing field. There was a promise made during the Millennium Development Goals when they were being formulated that duty-free, quota-free provisions would be made for the LDCs, and that hasn't happened so far. And on top of that, the GSP used to provide very small preferences to Bangladesh. It covered about 35 million in Bangladeshi exports, so it's a really small program to begin with. So at USBSC, we've always sort of argued for more expanded trade product coverage for Bangladesh, just because there's so many gains to be had with regard to women's empowerment, expansion of employment opportunities, and so on. And we believe that the GSP could be tied very specifically to improvements in labor. I'm not going to talk too much about the impact the suspension is going to have. I guess that remains to be seen. But it is unfair that a lot of the industries that are GSP related but have nothing to do with sort of the Rana factory collapse or previous fires in garments are kind of the victims of this new policy now, because you may see some people being laid off because there are sort of reduced opportunities to trade now under the GSP. With regard to sort of how to incentivize change, we feel that something could be set up with similar to what's been done in Cambodia, where there was a Clinton administration initiative to tie trade and labor issues together, where if Cambodia made significant progress, then greater market access would be provided. And that progress would be tracked by the ILO. So we could have a similar program with Bangladesh where a third party sort of tracks the progress. And this is kind of a really good time to talk about that, because you now have this plan by North American retailers to actually track progress in the industry. So even though I know on the Hill or elsewhere, people don't really want to hear about market access for Bangladesh, it's probably the last thing they want to hear about. This is actually the perfect time to talk about this, because now you can sort of have a third party, which this group, the alliance, that, as they're calling themselves, the group of retailers, are planning to set up a secretariat to track sort of the improvements over the next 5 years, provide trade capacity building support, and so on. So it could be a good way to sort of tie the progress that Bangladesh makes to expanded coverage for garments. And even if it's incremental, it doesn't have to be 100% right away, but maybe over a few years, it could provide incremental access going up to 100%. With regard to sort of the impact of the duties, it's about 732 million, I believe, that Bangladesh faces in terms of apparel duties. There's also a case that's been made by Sanchita Saxena, whose book you've reviewed, Dr. Kudus. She says that because these tariffs are being paid by U.S. apparel retailers, they're actually investing even less in factory improvements. So each U.S. retailer is having to pay a premium to import from Bangladesh, and so as a result, they have an excuse not to actually invest more in factory upgrades and worker safety and so on. So we have to also look at sort of the impact of sort of the current U.S. trade policy on factory safety and see if there's a way to sort of readjust the gains. Perhaps there could be a less of a reliance on U.S. tariffs by the U.S. government itself, and put more of that funding sort of in the court of U.S. retailers to tackle the labor issues. With regard to expanded coverage, I think there have been some figures thrown around that if you removed all tariffs on Bangladesh, there could be up to about 3 million more people employed in the industry. It could be even more. Bangladesh's population has also been rising, although at a slower rate, but there could be sort of much more employment expansion and poverty alleviation, especially for women. I want to also talk about a little bit about sort of what led to the GSP suspension. There have been sort of several petitions done by the AFL-CIO to revoke these benefits for Bangladesh, including sort of the more significant one in 2007, I think, which followed an incident in the garment industry. Their argument basically has been that we're acting on behalf of the Bangladeshi workers, but I just found a few quotes in the Bangladeshi media that are focused on what the union leaders are saying in Bangladesh, and I'll just quote a few people here. So according to the Bangladesh Textile Garment Workers Federation president, Mahbubur Rahman, he says the U.S. is saying that this was done for the sake of the workers, but this will not help them. Rather, they could have pressured the government to ensure compliance in garment factories, international standard salaries, and right to form trade unions. This is a direct quote from him. Another union leader, the Garment Worker Unity Forum president, Moshrefa Mishu, says this is a step against Bangladesh's interests and it's immoral. So these are just some examples of what union leaders in Bangladesh are saying. So we have to think about whether this has been a political move or it's really something that represents the interests of workers in Bangladesh. After all, if you're penalizing an industry that is not responsible for the recent incidents, then I'm not sure that that's the best way to incentivize change. So that needs to be kept in mind. And the other thing that I want to just quickly underscore is that we do have a lot of political unrest in Bangladesh, where workers go on strike, and a lot of things come to a standstill and so on. But at the same time, even though there's intimidation of some worker leaders and so on, people are allowed to strike. Whereas if you look at Burma, for example, unions have been kept out for decades, but the sanctions are now being lifted. So I think there needs to be sort of some moderation in terms of addressing, sort of these kinds of issues through trade policy. And in terms of Bangladesh's work to actually improve its labor standards, there needs to be a lot done. I think Dr. Kudus couldn't have said it better, and Ambassador Kader himself to acknowledge that there are a lot of ways in which Bangladesh could improve in terms of labor. But a lot of progress has been made. The country has ratified 7 of the 8 core ILO conventions. The government has taken steps to implement a lot of these ratifications through the Bangladesh Labor Act of 2006. It's strengthened some of the institutions that deal with occupational safety. Child labor has been largely eradicated. A lot of industry alliances have also improved factories, including sort of worker welfare councils in the export processing zones. The minimum wage has been doubled, and there are now sort of more expanded benefits for women in terms of maternity leaves and insurance benefits. The problem with some of this progress is that it's not very well documented. It's sort of dispersed here and there. So there's not sort of a one-stop shop to find out exactly what's going on with regard to Bangladesh's labor laws and implementation and so on. And I think that the communication needs to be better as well in terms of what the country is doing, especially when trade and labor issues are so linked. So Bangladesh now stands at a critical juncture. Over the past 20 years, it's cut poverty a whole lot. The NGOs, BRAC and Grameen, have really contributed a great deal as well as other NGOs to the development in Bangladesh. But the garment industry's impact on development, especially on women, is pretty much unrivaled and contributes a lot to sort of even when women decide to have children, how educated they are, and so on. So I think that needs to be sort of kept in mind whenever talking about Bangladesh trade policy. In terms of the plan this morning that was unveiled, we've been kind of an advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Alliance on sort of formulating this plan. We believe this is a step in the right direction. we do need some sort of accord by North American retailers that promises resources as well as monitoring progress and so on. We feel that there needs to be more of a coordination with some of the EU companies as well. The EU Accord represents about 70 retailers, so it's a very large group of retailers compared to sort of the US alliance. But they are promising similar range of resources. The US promises about 100 million. Some of it is in loans. The EU companies are promising around that same amount. So we think that in terms of implementing the actual changes, making sure that the factories are safe and inspections and so on, there needs to be more of a coordinated effort. Otherwise, you have a sort of a hodgepodge of different initiatives, and then a lot of resources get wasted. So that's kind of our main concern with that, is that it is a binding agreement. So I think that there's something good about that there's recourse in case companies don't deliver on some of their promises. And it includes also some innovative new projects, like having a hotline for workers so that workers can remain anonymous when complaining about situations within factories and so on. So there are some innovative ways to sort of deal with the issues, but I think in terms of really making sure that over the next 5 years, which is the time horizon of this plan, we get the best out of these resources to sort of have some kind of coordination mechanism. And also, the plan relies on the Bangladeshi labor representatives for its success, and that's another area where we feel that the government could step forward to make sure that the labor unions are not as politicized. A lot of the labor unions are sort of extensions of the two parties, and rarely sort of really are representing workers' interests. And then there are other labor unions who are funded by outside groups, and those are treated with suspicion as well. So we really need much more sort of homegrown unions that really represent workers' rights and can be a player in implementing these changes. We applaud all these initiatives by the companies. We also hope that U.S. policy will act in a similar spirit and really sort of think about what the real goals are instead of looking at sort of short-term political gains from revoking GSP and so on.
Great, thank you, Shamaroop. The reference to Burma is interesting, given that they are now being considered for GSP benefits. So maybe forced labor is better than unsafe labor. Because I don't know how you come to the conclusion that Burma should get it and Bangladesh should have it revoked. But, Ed, do you want to?
Sure. Hello, it's working? Yep. Thank you very much. I'm very honored and pleased to be here at Heritage. As Walter said, we've known one another for a long time, and despite differences in allegiances, I often very much feel with Walter and also with Brian that we have a lot in common, that when we look at U.S. policy, and not so much what is it the Obama administration is doing or not doing, but the structural features of trade policy that are inherited from one administration to the next, we identify a lot of the same problems. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you all for coming. A lot of the things I was hoping to say have been said, and very eloquently and correctly. So let me try to do a couple of things. One, pull back the lens a bit to talk from, well, it's a U.S. policy perspective. What do we like to achieve in the relationship with Bangladesh? What sort of relationship do we have now? And given that with GSP withdrawal, there's not a tremendous crisis, but a significant jolt to the relationship. Where do we go from here? And to begin with, kind of the biggest point, I think it is very interesting and heartening in discussion of the American relationship with a large majority Muslim country that we begin with a panel devoted to trade policy and economics and jobs and how do we best handle those sorts of things. This is much as we'd have in a similar event focusing on Indonesia or Malaysia. It is not what would happen in the event focusing on much of the Middle East. And I think that says something very positive about the relationship and very positive about Bangladesh as a country. And one of the goals, I think, of U.S. policy would be that in 5 years or 10 years, events focusing on Bangladesh would again begin with trade and investment, and how do we create jobs, and how do we improve the lives of workers and whatnot. So there's a lot of success to build upon in this relationship, and a lot of this comes from a very remarkable national Bangladeshi record in economic development, in which the garment industry has played an important part. Dr. Kudus shared a lot of statistics. Drawing from the World Bank, I've found quite similar ones. Deep poverty down from 70% to 40% since 1990, two-third reduction in infant mortality, 13-year gain in life expectancy, 50% increase in school leaving. And what this all means as a country, Bangladesh is true a least developed country. It was placed on the least developed country list when it became independent, but it may soon be off that list. By 2017 or 2018 or whatever, if you look at the IMF growth patterns, they're 5% through the 1990s, 6% through the last decade, projected to go up to 7%. And it is quite likely that based on those trends, Bangladesh will no longer be a least developed country within a fairly short period of time, assuming things go as the IMF thinks they will. And that would be quite an accomplishment. The LDC list, developed by the United Nations in 1971, has 43 countries on it. Only 3 countries have ever gotten off this list, and they are all anomalous cases. There's Botswana, which left because of large diamond strikes and because of good governance. There are Cape Verde and the Maldives, which got off because of development of tropical island tourism. Those are not things that can be replicated in other countries. Those are unique natural resource or natural endowment things that those countries were able to capitalize on. For Bangladesh to leave the LDC list, it would mean exiting the list based on education and economic growth and development of successful export industries. So those are things that can happen, more or less, anywhere in the world, and would happen in a country of 160 million people. The whole LDC list together is 850 million people. So it would be a remarkable achievement and a great sign of hope to low-income countries and people everywhere in the world. So that I think is something really that the country should take a lot of pride in and place a lot of hopes in. Garment industry, as both Shamaruk and Dr. Kudus have mentioned, is a big part of this. And in a way, the success of the garment industry, it seems to me, has led us to this juncture where we are now. If we look back to the period of the end of the quota system, in that year, 2004, the last year of quotas, there were about $6 billion worth of clothing exports from Bangladesh. Now they're about 20 billion a year. There were about 2 million garment workers then, and about 4 million now, or a little bit more. There were about 4,000 factories then, and about 5,400 now. So as Dr. Kudus mentioned, or used the term is grown up like a mushroom. Mushrooms, I've actually, by coincidence, kind of been studying the American mushroom industry over the past couple of weeks. It is based in Chester, Pennsylvania. They grow half the mushrooms sold in the US, and a mushroom doubles in size every 24 hours. And I mean, it's a bit kind of a jocular comparison, but I think this very, very rapid growth of the garment industry has contributed to some of the problems that we're experiencing now. That within the last 10 years, and especially within the last 5 years, there have been a lot of buildings going up that are well short of code. There have been floors added to existing buildings that were not supposed to be put on and are not safe. There are a lot of people coming into the industry who are not very experienced in fire management and safety. And so there has been not only several very widely publicized kind of agonizing events, but a structural development of the industry that has led to a lot of concern internationally in the US government and also within the buyers of Bangladeshi products. Shamaruk has sort of gone through the alliance plan, but I'd like to highlight just one line in it, which is a quotation from CEOs of the 17 alliance members, says the safety record of Bangladeshi factories is unacceptable and requires our collective effort. We can prevent future tragedies by consolidating and amplifying our individual efforts to bring about real and sustained progress. So that means, one, that the companies want Bangladesh to succeed. They want the industry to continue to support the growth and development of the country, but they're quite alarmed. When they say something like unacceptable safety records, that's a very strong statement for business executives to make. It's, you may expect it from activists or people in Congress or the press, but it is a real, awakener that the buyers of the products are quite alarmed about the industry and are really looking to some significant changes. What might those be? Fundamentally, they require some physical change and some cultural change in a way. Buildings need to be remediated if dangerous or scrapped. Managers need much better safety training, and workers need to be able to go to them or go to a third party and say, we think there's a problem in the factory that is arousing fear and concern, and something needs to be done about it. The Dhaka municipal government and the labor ministry, I think, need much more capacity to be able to implement public services. And these are things that are kind of urgent for the industry to retain its success, because I share with Shamaruk and Dr. Kudus and Walter the view that the removal of GSP is, maybe it's a signal of concern, but it's not a positive contribution that will help fix the problems. The idea of a duty-free program is a much better one, and one that I personally support. But it is, it's also it's a sentiment that not only is in the administration, but is in the buyers. And that's something that I think Bangladeshi government and industry need to take quite seriously and work with them to restore the confidence that's been a bit shaken. If this happens over the next 3 months, the next year, and next 5 years, then I think the future, is, in the theme of the symposium, really is going to be good, is going to be better, and within a relatively short time, Bangladesh will be off the LDC list. It will be a middle-income country. It will have growing and diversifying industries. And I think that would be very much what the U.S. administration or Americans looking at this relationship as a generally very successful example of a partnership between the U.S. and a big developing country, a big majority Muslim country, really Americans should hope to see and should be aiming for. And I think in that we are probably all united. And again, it's something that I feel Heritage really deserves applause and congratulations for bringing us together on such a timely event and such an important topic. And I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you. We've got some time for questions. I want to open it up. I have a question if others don't, but I've taken enough time, so. Well, let me just start out, and maybe you all will think a little bit in the interim. When we talked about challenges to the economy and in the garment sector or anywhere else, how much of it is a business environment issue, a rule of law issue, that sort of thing? I mean, you build 2 more floors on the top of a factory, unauthorized and unregulated, because it takes so darn long to get a permit, and you've got to pay off so many people that it's just not worth it, so you build it yourself and it collapses. Or, you have building inspectors, to the extent you do, that they're easily bought and paid for. I mean, how much are those sort of really economic freedom issues a challenge, and how do you get at the challenges through liberal reform, basically, opening up the economy more, a well-regulated economy?
I'll take it. I'll take a stab. I think Ed was right. Ed is right that this is part of the growing pains. The industry has expanded so rapidly, so in a short period of time, that the institutions have sort of fallen behind the actual growth on the ground. But it shows these incidents, these are all accidents, and accidents can happen anywhere. But there were also preventable tragedies. In each case, you had some culpability on the part of the managers on the ground and the part of the owners and so on. And that's what makes these into tragedies. So there was failure of self-regulation. We have seen it in Wall Street. We see it in other places. I mean, free markets and capitalisms are great. They are the best strategies and mechanisms to create wealth. But they have to be the rule of the game, and those have to be followed. So here you had a failure of self-regulation, and then you have sort of a regulatory capture. When you have these very powerful and very rich individuals, they become politicians, and so they have control in a society where generally corruption is endemic. Despite all of this progress that we have mentioned, Bangladesh remains on the Transparency International list as one of the more corrupt countries. So we have to recognize that. And so those are the two comments I have about the failure of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. We have a microphone. Please identify yourself.
It's about the challenges Dr. Munir Kado said. You mentioned infrastructure is a challenge of addressing poverty and other things. What do you think about the communication, especially the Padma Bridge and other areas of Bangladesh? Basically, the rural areas and the capital's communication. It's not. The government is not being able to construct these projects because of corruption. What do you think about corruption? You did not mention corruption in your speech. What is your comments?
Before I address that, do you have any comment on the previous question?
Well, I guess I'm not at all expert on licensing and building and local government, but what Walter mentioned, it sounds very plausible to me, that part of the challenge is to get a very professional municipal government and inspection team that has usable procedures that will review an application and will be able to go to a building and inspect it professionally and dispassionately. Yes, this one is okay, this one is not. That's a big part of the challenge, is governance and public services, as well as the responsibilities of businesses.
One comment I wanted to add was that markets work well when there's a balance of power. Whenever you have too much power in the hands of one of the actors, whether it's monopoly power, any kind of power, then you have market failure. And here you have a situation where the owners probably have too much power. And so what we need is some countervailing power, and that's why we need to empower the workers more. There has to be transparency in the process. We need to get the cameras into the factories and so on. Bangladesh has had an unfortunate history of violent labor conflicts, labor management, so we have to move past that. In terms of corruption, it remains a big problem, and it puts a cloud over all of the considerable achievements the country has. And it has sustained and it has grown under different political parties. So that's very unfortunate. When I was studying the garment industry, one of the interesting questions was, in this land where there's so much corruption in the system, how come the garment industry is so successful? And the answer is that it has benefited from the corruption, and it has added to the corruption also. I turned into an investigative journalist, and I went to the Dhaka Customs House with some of the factory mid-level managers, and they were trying to move some paperwork to export. And I saw cash exchange hand, even up to the officers level. It was amazing to see that. So in some sense, at some level, perhaps corruption greases the wheels and makes it possible for things to be done. But more importantly, the big picture is that it's a big failure of markets, and it is something that we need to control. We need to take care of this. And so coming back to the issue of infrastructure, that's another big challenge. Investment in infrastructure is a win-win. You create jobs, you address the issue of poverty, and then you invite more investment because it's a public good that's good for the country. If you look at countries that have done well, whether it's Thailand or Vietnam, India is getting there now, they have taken very ambitious infrastructure projects. And Bangladesh has to make sure that its infrastructure is really modernized.
I just want to add one quick thing, which is I think with the plans for Digital Bangladesh, which is kind of getting more information out there in the digital world, including laws and implementation and so on, we can actually help address some of these issues. And it'll take a while for the country to actually get on the digital platform so that everyone's online and looking at these and making decisions. But I think it's kind of something to be considered. I mean, in the U.S., you've seen sort of more openness, government openness, through digital platforms, internet platforms, and so on. So I think if a lot of information is made public, including even sort of what the requirements are for specific buildings, how tall they should be, I think the more information you can actually put out in the public, the more you can actually safeguard yourself against corruption.
Yeah, I sense a certain, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a certain acceptance of the logic, at least in the GSP decision. That is, it's not good for industry and be a better way to do it, but maybe we can work out a deal more like Cambodia has or something, a certain just buying of the underlying logic. It's interesting because I think that could go very wrong. I guess my approach to it would be much more direct, which is what the alliance has done here is the way you go after these issues. You get the companies that are interested to adopt voluntary binding standards, and you go at it that way, as opposed to buying into the logic that the U.S. government should be involved in setting the standards and that sort of thing. And if you get, for instance, with Cambodia, the deal that Cambodia got in the 90s, or I guess it was probably 2000, it was close to that. I mean, it was a gift to Cambodia. Cambodia was not Cambodia was not a threat. Mm-hmm. Bangladesh is a big enough producer that it's a threat to labor in the United States, the way the labor unions see it. And so you're going to get them involved. If you buy the underlying logic, you're going to get them involved in writing the standards. And they're not going to be as generous as they were to little Cambodia, just tossing a bone to Cambodia. So it might be a wrong approach. What do you think, Ed?
Okay, well, I'm glad you brought this up because this was a very harmonic and discussion, which lacks almost any argument at all. Everyone's sort of agreeing all the time. The Cambodia case was in 1999. This was while I was at the USTR. I was kind of watching it and as it happened. What happened there was that Cambodia was, as you say, a kind of small country and a very troubled one. It had a terrible history of Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese occupation and so forth. Began to develop a garment industry largely because of the textile quota system, that there was some overflow from China and Hong Kong. It rose up very fast. We got then requests from the textile industry associations to impose a quota on them. And I think the administration felt sort of guilty about it because Cambodia was so poor and so troubled, and I think people, at least in the Clinton administration, sort of felt whatever one, looking back at the Vietnam War era is kind of a long time ago, but the U.S. was in some way involved in the destruction of Cambodia and wanted to be in some way involved in the rebuilding of it. And rather than be as draconian as some of the requests were, we offered them a kind of somewhat better deal, but it was still a protectionist deal that limited their exports. They said, we'll give you extra quota if you if you do these following things with labor standards. And in practice, it actually worked quite well, and in part because the minister there, Chancellor Sid, was very personally committed to the program, and he's been there for almost 20 years, and it's his baby, and he's sort of watched it and enforced it year after year. And by the time the quota system ended, Cambodians had come to feel this is something that differentiates us from quite a lot of other garment exporters. It's something that's unique about Cambodia and something that we want to preserve. And I think there are a lot of good lessons in it probably for Bangladesh today, grappling with the situation we have now. In terms of the administration, it is quite rare for administrations to pull GSP over labor issues. I looked back a bit. The last one I could find was Belarus in 1997, and before that, Mauritania in 1993. I think the administration did this quite reluctantly, that they probably internally share a lot of the views we have here, but feel that given the terms of the GSP Statute of making progress toward internationally recognized labor standards as a condition of eligibility, they may feel that they really legally didn't have much choice. And so I think they are not so much interested in punishing the country as in making a statement and fulfilling or kind of preserving the credibility of the GSP conditionality system. I don't think they really felt they had much choice in the matter. And whether it's right or not to say, here's the logic of withdrawal of GSP followed by some standard setting, I don't think they felt there was many options left.
Well, I think we have to leave it there, and so we have plenty of time for the next panel. They've got an hour also. So no, let's leave it here so we can stay on schedule, Rita. But thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel. It was a terrific discussion.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with our next panel. I'm Lisa Curtis. I'm Senior Research Fellow for South Asia here at the Heritage Foundation, and thank you so much for staying on for this panel. I know it's getting late in the afternoon, and I appreciate you staying, and I'm sure we're going to make it worth your while. So this panel is focused on politics and security, and certainly there has been significant political unrest in Bangladesh this year. Most of it has been related to the War Crimes Tribunal, which has begun to hand down verdicts against those accused of committing severe human rights abuses during the 1971 war for Bangladeshi independence. It's estimated that over 150 people have died in street clashes in just the last 6 months. And of course, we've seen protest demonstrations. We've seen peaceful demonstrations by secularists calling for harsher punishments of leaders that allegedly committed these abuses in 1971. And we've seen protest demonstrations, some unfortunately that have turned very violent, by Islamists demanding stricter Islamic laws for the country. So what does this volatility portend for Bangladesh? Will some of these tensions that have been unleashed by the War Crimes Tribunal, will they intensify as the country approaches national elections that are scheduled to take place by January? Are these protest demonstrations at heart about Bangladeshi identity? Is political Islam gaining steam in the country? Here to answer these and other questions, we have a very distinguished panel of guests. And I'm just delighted to welcome Dr. Alyssa Ayres, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. We know she is very busy. I just heard a list of the things that she is doing this week, including preparing the Vice President for his trip to India later this month, heading up the South Asia portion of the China SED talks. So Alyssa has a very busy schedule, and we're just delighted that she took the time to come here today and talk about Bangladesh. Now, Alyssa has been at the State Department since August 2010 in this position, but prior to that, she worked at McLarty Associates, where she led the India and South Asia practice. She had previously served in the State Department, which I think is when I first met her, when she was an International Affairs Fellow on staff for the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. She also worked at the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Asia Society in New York, and as an interpreter for the International Committee of the Red Cross. She is a cultural historian by training, receiving an A.B. magna cum laude from Harvard College and an M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. Her book on Pakistan, which is called Speaking Like a State, was published in 2009 and won an award from the American Institute of Pakistan Studies. She has also co-edited 3 books on India and Indian foreign policy. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 2 other guests as well, and then we can start the panel discussion. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Ali Riaz, who is professor and chair of the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University. Prior to joining Illinois State University, he taught at Claflin University in South Carolina, as well as the University of Lincoln in England. He was an assistant professor at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh between 1993 and 95, as well as he worked for the BBC World Service for 5 years. Professor Riaz has earned several awards at Illinois State University, including Outstanding Scholarly Achievement, Outstanding College Researcher, and the Pi Sigma Alpha Excellence in Teaching Award. He has published numerous books, including God Willing, The Politics of Islamism in Bangladesh. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Maniza Hossain. Maniza is a good friend of the Heritage Foundation. In fact, we have published articles together and are going to be doing so in the future as well. And we're delighted to have her here for at least her second, if not third time. Maniza is a specialist on the politics and culture of Bangladesh. She's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director of the Daily Ittifaq, one of Bangladesh's oldest newspapers. She's a trained lawyer and a native of Dhaka, and she has written several monographs on Islamism in Bangladesh, including Broken Pendulum, Bangladesh's Swing to Radicalism. Prior to joining Hudson, Ms. Hossain was fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and her writings on the impact and prospects of radical Islam on both the politics and culture of South Asia have appeared in several publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Times of India, the Weekly Standard, National Review, and Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. With that, I'm going to hand the discussion over to our 3 distinguished guests, starting with Alyssa on my right.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Lisa. It's great to be here. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. Thank you, Walter, for the Asia Studies Center sponsorship of this day focused on Bangladesh. We've been really impressed with the amount of attention and focus that Heritage has brought to looking at Bangladesh's issue. I know that you've traveled there as well and have had a kind of strong focus on the country. You asked me to focus for today because we've got 2 experts on Islam in Bangladesh. So you asked me to focus a little bit more on what the Obama administration is doing and our engagement, the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship. So I'm happy to do that and kind of lay out the broader framework of how we are engaged before getting to some of these challenging questions like political violence and what's been happening over the course of the last several months. We were happy to see that today's seminar is titled Moving Bangladesh Toward a Better Future. So what I thought I would do is begin my remarks here by noting the importance that the Obama administration places on our relationship with Bangladesh. We recently had an important visit, a sub-cabinet level visit. Undersecretary for Political Affairs Wendy Sherman was out in Dhaka at the end of May. And she said during her visit there, the success of the Bangladesh story has implications not just for Bangladeshis, but for the entire global community. Bangladeshi entrepreneurs enhance regional trade, Bangladeshi writers and artists enrich our lives, and Bangladeshi peacekeepers bring hope to troubled parts of the world. Bangladesh, the world's 7th most populous country, is a moderate Muslim majority nation of some 160 million people, and it has seen economic growth rates of around 5 to 6% for most of the last 2 decades. So that is something to be quite proud of. Bangladesh has also pioneered microfinance, empowering millions of women with the power to shape their own livelihoods. Over the past 2 decades, and this is something that I hope everybody in the room will be well aware of, over the past 2 decades, Bangladesh has increased life expectancy by 10 years, decreased infant mortality by 2/3, and doubled female literacy. Those are very impressive developments. The poverty rate also has dropped from 40% to 31% over the past 5 years. Bangladesh has achieved self-sufficiency in rice production and is on track for self-sufficiency in overall food production by the end of the decade. And as we now know so well, Bangladesh has emerged as the world's second largest exporter of ready-made garments, second only to China. So these are all metrics of hard work, of achievement, and of a country that's focused on bettering the opportunities it is able to afford to its people. Those are areas that we are very engaged with the government and the people of Bangladesh, and we are building on all of those in our bilateral relationship. So with those accomplishments, thinking about the areas that Bangladesh is really focused on growing, let me say a few words about how we're expanding our cooperation. If you look today at everything we are doing together bilaterally, we are partnering in almost every field of human endeavor, from things like disaster readiness and response, health, food security, agriculture, climate change, governance, and beyond. Bangladesh, as may have been mentioned earlier, Bangladesh is a partner country for all 4 of President Obama's signature initiatives. Those are Feed the Future, which is our food security initiative, the Global Health Initiative, the Global Climate Change Initiative, and Muslim engagement. We have also praised the government of Bangladesh for their focus in the region. They have consistently prioritized improved relations with India and greater regional economic integration as their top foreign policy initiatives. A key U.S. interest in the region is trying to promote and develop regional economic integration. As I think Lisa knows so well, this is a region of the world that is least integrated with interregional trade. With Bangladesh, our cooperation on security issues ranges now from counterterrorism to counter-piracy and mitigation of natural disasters. It has never been better. In fact, we have dramatically increased what we were doing together in this set of areas. Working together, we have strengthened Bangladesh's ability to secure its maritime borders from piracy, terrorism, trafficking of persons, trafficking of drugs and arms. Bangladesh can now better protect its fish and other resources as well in the Bay of Bengal. As I believe was mentioned earlier, Bangladesh also plays a growing role in multilateral organizations, and which, for reasons I'm not entirely sure, it's not as well known, but this is incredibly important. Bangladesh is the largest contributor in the world to UN peacekeeping missions worldwide, with nearly 9,000 Bangladeshis on duty in various operations around the world. Again, that is a contribution that everybody should be quite proud of. So we assist the government of Bangladesh in ways to improve its own disaster preparedness and response through things like the development of multi-purpose cyclone shelters, coastal crisis management centers. These centers are actually dual-purpose structures which offer the Bangladesh Coast Guard a location to work out of in order for them to increase their ability to plan and conduct maritime security and disaster relief operations. Each center provides a location for over 1,500 people to be safely housed in the event of a cyclone, which does happen from time to time in Bangladesh, until they can safely return to their homes. As I mentioned, a demonstration of our broadening relationship was Under Secretary Sherman's recent visit to Dhaka. We created the partnership dialogue between the U.S. and Bangladesh. We mutually created this last year. The United States hosted the first meeting of the partnership dialogue last fall, and so the second meeting of the partnership dialogue took place at the very end of May in Dhaka. It was the first time the government of Bangladesh hosted. We're excited about having a kind of a regular senior level, high level meeting on an annual basis where we can review progress in the relationship and identify areas for cooperation in the coming year. The meeting of the partnership dialogue reflected the type of extensive relationship that we now have. We had, in fact, quite good interagency participation on the delegation. We also jointly announced a number of new programs and initiatives in global health, in climate change, and in law enforcement, where we also had a quite positive, robust, and growing relationship with Bangladesh. In Dhaka, we also celebrated the successful transfer of a Coast Guard cutter, the Jarvis, which is now the largest ship in the Bangladesh Navy. U.S.-Bangladeshi cooperation extends beyond our two governments. There's a very active Bangladeshi diaspora. I hope some members of the Bangladeshi diaspora are here today. In trade and investment, there's now $6 billion in annual trade, and more American companies are looking to establish or expand operations in Bangladesh. So the private sector is also becoming an increasingly central component of the relationship. In May, at the Partnership Dialogue, we actually added a new component reflecting the growing importance of our private sector engagement. So we added a private sector forum. This was the first time that we had private sector participants coming together with the government dialogue in order to share and exchange views. This is something that we do with a number of our different dialogues, and we've now added that to our Bangladesh dialogue, which is really most welcome. It gives the private sector leaders an opportunity to inform both governments about challenges that they see and their recommendations of things that we can do to better enhance trade and investment. So this obviously reflects the importance that so many people are now placing on what we are able to do together on the trade and investment side. So this panel is set up to take a look at political and security challenges, and I'd like to shift now to highlight ways that we are engaging in some of the challenges that have emerged in the recent months. I wanted to address two of these in particular, which Lisa already flagged. There is definitely growing concern that won't be a surprise to anyone here with the current political deadlock over identifying an electoral framework for national elections. The elections will be due by the end of January 2014. The United States government position has been to consistently encourage all parties to engage in serious dialogue over the ground rules to ensure a free, fair, and credible electoral process that the Bangladeshi public will view as legitimate. We have been very clear with all parties that we take no position on the merits of a caretaker government. It's up to the Bangladeshi parties to decide what the mechanism should be going forward. As Lisa mentioned, there is another matter which has been in the news in recent months, and that is the trials at Bangladesh's International Crimes Tribunal, the ICT. While the United States supports bringing to justice those who commit atrocities, we believe that any trials must be free, fair, and transparent. The trials should be in accordance with international standards Bangladesh has agreed to uphold through its ratification of international agreements, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We've been very engaged with Bangladesh on the question of the ICT. We have an ambassador for global criminal justice, Ambassador Stephen Rapp. He's traveled to Bangladesh several times. As he noted during his trip to Dhaka in May, we have seen some progress in the way the prosecution has presented its case, but the United States still believes that improvements are needed so that international rule of law standards can be met, and so that the rights of victims and the rights of accused are satisfied. The trial's verdicts and the deadlock over an electoral framework have led to an increasing number of hartals, or strikes. I probably don't have to explain this to people in the room. So we've been very concerned about the hartals and the related violence. Everybody following Bangladesh is concerned about the hartals and the related violence. This past year, there's been a number of deaths during a series of hartals. These disruptions also come actually at great cost to Bangladeshi citizens. They prevent people from going to work and from doing their jobs, and that only hurts the Bangladeshi economy as a whole. So while engaging in peaceful protest is a fundamental democratic right, we firmly believe that violence is never an answer. We look to and have called upon the government of Bangladesh to ensure the safety of its citizens, and we encourage Bangladeshis to peacefully express their views. We also regularly call upon the opposition parties to ensure that their protests are peaceful. I wanted to say one word about the labor set of issues. This is very big and in the news, and I know the previous panel covered economic developments in Bangladesh, but I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a couple words about the situation there on labor. As you all know, on June 27th, President Obama decided to suspend the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, over our continuing concerns over the inadequate protection of labor rights. We remain committed to working with the Bangladeshi government to take the necessary steps to improve labor rights and working conditions in order to regain GSP benefits. Bangladesh's development gains have come in part because of its growth in the ready-made garment sector, as I mentioned, now the second largest in the world behind China. And this is a sector that employs between 3 and 4 million Bangladeshis, mostly women, helping to lift them out of poverty and empowering them socially and economically. So we hope that the tragedies at Tazreen Factory last fall and Rana Plaza will serve as a wake-up call to all Bangladeshis to spur lasting change in the RMG sector and to support Bangladesh's continued economic development. In that light, we applaud the work that's being carried out by the government of Bangladesh, the EU, the ILO, industry groups, and major brands to increase workplace safety in Bangladesh. We are coordinating closely with these and other stakeholders to make sure that our efforts are synchronized. So those are my sort of formal remarks. I know we'll have questions later. I know Professor Riaz and Muniza will also have more to say, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive overview of what we're doing with Bangladesh. And I guarantee you, I worked at the State Department 10 years ago, and we're doing a lot more.
Doing a lot.
We're very engaged, and I'm very pleased to hear everything that we're doing. And again, we're just so fortunate to have Alyssa bring her perspective and give us an idea of the real world. It's not, we can talk up here as academics and think tankers all we want, but it's great to have the administration perspective. And now let's move to Dr. Riaz.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. It's a great honor and privilege to be here, especially in a panel with Elisa and, of course, Muniza. Let me start with the bad news. Moving Bangladesh toward a better future, if there is any roadblock towards moving Bangladesh in that direction, it is not the economy. It is not the ingenuity of Bangladeshis. It is not the lack of creativity or lack of resource, human resource to be precise. It is the political structure and the political leadership. Over the past 42 years, particularly over the last 3 decades, Bangladeshi political leaders have failed to deliver what they have promised to and what they should have done. So if there is any problem going forward, and as I see moving forward, this would be the issue. Currently, there are 2 central issues that Bangladeshi politics is trying to grapple with. Number 1, what would be the system of governance, or to be precise, what would be the form of government during the upcoming election? Since the 15th Amendment, the situation has changed, and which is unfortunately not for better. It has created more problems than it could have resolved. Personally, I have never been a fan of a caretaker system. It is an insult to the political system per se, and it is an insult to the political leadership always. However, exactly the reasons which created in 1996 the caretaker system has not gone away. The lack of trust among the political parties and political leadership is still there, and that's why removing it through the constitutional amendment has not done anything good. And this has become a major issue of contentions, and many, many problems are, in my understanding, is originated there. What would be the solution? We don't know. I mean, the political party which once opposed it now is in favor of that, and that whole situation it's very difficult to explain why someone is supporting and why someone is opposing at this point. But nevertheless, that is the issue. The second issue, which is not an immediate, but it has a ramification for the immediate politics. That is, what would be the relationship between religion and politics in Bangladesh, which Lisa has a little bit flagged on the issue. So, as I said, I mean, let me bring the bad news. So both of these issues have remained in the forefront of Bangladesh politics, and until we can actually address it, and address it in a very subjective manner, and at the same time, not so being passionate. In Bangladesh, politics is a matter of passion, perhaps elsewhere too, but in case of Bangladesh, anything political brings out the best and the worst of an individual. With that kind of environment, what I'm going to focus, as I have asked Lisa to focus on the Islamist politics. But as I say, these 2 questions, the form of government during the upcoming election and the rise of Islamist political forces are directly connected in some ways or another. Most of this attention in recent days have been because of the rise of Hifazat Islam. Bangladesh Islamist politics in Bangladesh has drawn attention, but not as much media coverage as we have seen since the rise of Hifazat Islam. Who are these people? Where did they come from? I mean, most of these things that we have seen, in many cases, the media coverage has been with lack of context. Suddenly, this group has emerged. No, it hasn't suddenly. It hasn't emerged suddenly. In case of Bangladesh, the Islamist politics have always had many trends. As it happens, look at Egypt, look at elsewhere. Islamist politics is not a homogeneous politics. Like any other politics, it has its own differentiation. But there are two major trends that we have seen over the years, over the decades, or you can go back few decades. What happened is one Islamist politics was largely what we would call the orthodox trend, which is largely based on the Qawmi madrasas. Most of you are familiar with the Qawmi madrasas. They're privately owned. This is mostly supported in the rural areas. And it is an extension, and it is not new. It is an extension of a 19th century Islamist movement called Faraizi movement, which has been there, which was a dormant one. And this reflection of this politics we have seen in smaller splinter groups and smaller political parties like Nizam-e-Islami, Bangladesh Ulama Islam, and so on and so forth. They existed post-1972, precisely post-1976 they have existed. However, they have remained fragmented, they have remained weak, and each and every time they found an issue, they try to come together. We have seen 3 efforts so far in the last 42 years where these orthodox smaller groups have tried to come together to broaden their platform and approach to or appeal to a larger audience. When it happened, Hafiz-e Huzur, when he first ran for the public office, for the first time in the late 1970s, we have seen that someone tied to Qawmi Madrasa can actually look for a higher political office. And that was the first time that we have seen post-1972 a formulation of some kind of a platform that would give this orthodox trend a space within the mainstream politics. It didn't work. The second attempt that we have seen in early 2001, what happened was that there was a verdict from the High Court saying that fatwa is banned. At that point, we have seen that emergence of a platform that opposed that one. They tried to come together and oppose it. It partly worked, partly didn't work. We have also seen similar kind of smaller effort. Islamic Oikojot is the emergence of Islamic Oikojot is one reflection of that. Interestingly enough, it says Islamic Oikojot. Anyone familiar with Bengali would know Oiko and Jot both indicates unity. But there are at least 5 different organizations with the name Islamic Oikojot, because it came together and then fragmented. So these fragmentation of these smaller Qawmi madrasa-based, they were trying to come together. Now, there was another element, and there is another trend. As I said, there are many, but the second mainstream Islamist trend is represented by Jamaat-e-Islami. Jamaat-e-Islami emerged mostly in post-1976 in Bangladesh. Not that it didn't exist before. It existed before. Within the Pakistani politics existed. In 1971, late 1971, it was disbanded. 1972 constitution proscribed it. Because you cannot have a religion-based organization in Bangladesh, but it emerged post-1972, first as the Islamic Democratic League and then by its own name. They were representing a trend which is contrary to the orthodox one. That's why some people call them as a reformist. But what happened is that their support base is largely what is called Aliyah Madrasa, but beyond that. It would be inaccurate to say they have only support within the Aliyah Madrasa. They have support within the other educational institution. They are the one which represents modernist political Islam, representing Maududi. His ideology represents Sayyid Qutb's ideology, Hassan al-Banna's ideology, and what they have seen as a political, they would participate in the mainstream politics so long that they can push their agenda of establishing an Islamic State. Now, their vision of Islamic State is contrary to the vision of the Islamic State that the Orthodox trend intends to bring in. So there has always been a conflict and contradiction between these two streams. Now what we are witnessing, and that is why it makes sense at this moment, what we are witnessing is this merger to a certain extent, if not merger, at least a kind of an understanding, kind of a working together relationship between these two Islamist groups that is represented by Hifazat Islam on the one hand and Jamaat-e-Islami on the other hand. Jamaat-e-Islami is in the back foot for obvious reasons. particularly since this government came into power and war crime trials have been started. Now, since they are in the back foot, of course, they were looking for an opportunity to come back and push their agenda. And when Hifazat-e-Islam came up, Hifazat-e-Islam is opposed to Jamaat-e-Islami, at least was opposed to Jamaat-e-Islami. If you read the publications of, say, for example, the leader of Hifazat-e-Islam, Allama Shafi, he was very critical of Maududi. Yet they came together. Why they could then come together? They came together largely because two issues. One is the war crime trial. What they see as a war crime trial as a major issue, because they think that this is basically a trial of the Islamists. So in future, this is going to be an agenda of the secular Bangladeshi state to proscribe them, and hence they would have no space whatsoever. This perceived threat to Islamist politics is the one which brought them together, because both of them are actually fighting an existential threat to them. However, the Ganajagran Manchu tried to explain that this is not an anti-Islamist movement. They have tried to explain that this is not against the Islamist political parties. The government has done as much as it could, but given the political crisis at this moment, that has created the space for coming together of these political forces and becoming a formidable issue or formidable force in Bangladeshi politics. Will they succeed? The point is that whether they would succeed or not, they have succeeded in doing one thing already. They have changed the discourse of Bangladeshi politics. When Prime Minister is speaking of running Bangladesh under Medina Charter, it is basically a victory of the Islamists, so to say. When Khaleda Zia has actually embraced, without knowing the name of the political party, what was the name of this ulama's organization? She spoke in a public meeting. She has no idea what she's talking about, what party she's talking about. Forget about their agenda. Accepting their agenda by BNP and its allies because of the Jamaat-e-Islami practically has changed the discourse in Bangladeshi politics. They have turned the whole table saying that this is a battle about the atheist and the faithful. Absolutely not. Because it should not have been, and it had never been, a battle of the atheist versus the faithful. But by changing that discourse, what they have done, they have made an enormous success. In the electoral politics, Bangladeshi Islamists are very insignificant. Look at the electoral support of the last 3 or 4 elections. Never had they secured more than 8% of electoral votes. Then disproportionately, Bangladeshi Islamists have exercised their influence disproportionately on Bangladeshi politics since 1976, because both the major political parties, and I can say it by name, Awami League and the BNP, has made Faustian bargain with them on many occasions, and that is what led to this kind of situation. And that is what actually created in a situation wherein we're seeing that given the absence of an understanding between the political parties as to what would be the form of the government during the election, they are taking the advantage of it. I'm not opposed to Islamist politics per se, because they have the right as a democratic politics, but at the same time, the Jamaat-e-Islami should have been tried, not because of being an Islamist political party, but because of their involvement with a heinous crime and a genocide in 1971, as much as the Nazi party have been. So the argument is not about whether the war crime trial should go on or not. It is a commitment not only of Awami League, it is a commitment of the nation. This should have been taken place a long time ago. It hasn't, but the time has not gone. It is still necessary to try those who have committed heinous crime, but that does not mean that that can be used as a political tool for any political agenda or, for that matter, any political goal. And that is where it became a little bit controversial. Does not mean that there is no support from the popular. We don't have data, but mostly anecdotal evidence is very clear that there is a huge popularity in regard to the trial of the war crime, and that should continue at any cost. However, the broad-based support that we have seen by politicization by both parties, and particularly BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami, has taken the shortcut to address this issue. Now the question is whether Islamists are gaining ground, meaning in the long term, are we looking at a different kind of Bangladeshi politics, meaning whether there would be more rhetoric, more icon and symbol of the Islamist politics. At this point, it depends on how the next election and beyond the election the political parties behave. So far, they have not behaved responsibly. They are giving each and every day, they are providing more and more space to them. By accepting, they are not only accepting their demands, but by saying, as Prime Minister, leading to the crisis, say that, okay, we will consider some of the demands. And then she retracted and said, no, we are not going to consider those demands. You know, until Bangladesh's secularists have a firm ground and stand firmly on their basic principles, and if each and every time, as they have been doing since 1976, and particularly 1991, the expediency has ruled, and the Bangladeshi political parties have given inches and then miles and God knows how much. You know. So with that kind of situation, looking at Hifazat-e-Islam as just as a one element and looking at it as if that it has emerged suddenly out of nowhere, I don't tend to agree with that. And do I see why do I see the future of Hifazat-e-Islam as an organization? I do not think that Hifazat-e-Islam as an organization is going to stay for long. I don't see that one. Some people may disagree with me because the reason I see that one, if you look at the previous occasions when the Islamists of that strand has come together, it didn't stand for long. It is not in the interest of them as well to stay together. They're trying to create a space within which they can dictate. If Jamaat-e-Islami becomes weaker, they would like to take that space, where Jamaat-e-Islami over the last years and decades have disproportionately dictated the Bangladeshi politics. No political party with such a small support has been influencing and exercising so much power that Jamaat-e-Islami has done during the last regime, i.e. between 2001 and 2006, and in terms of political rhetoric and political decisions. So with that kind of situation, I do not see that Jamaat-e-Islami, for that matter, as an organization, is becoming a huge issue. That does not take away the argument that if someone has committed a heinous crime at certain points, especially crimes against humanity and genocide, they should be tried. There is no doubt in my mind. Islamist politics and 1971 war crime are actually two different things, and that should be dealt to differently. With that kind, I understand that I might have caused some concern among the audience in regard to my understanding, but broadly speaking, that is where I see Bangladesh going. So these are the issues that need to be addressed, and I'm hoping, but I'm not very optimistic in regard to the present political leadership of addressing them judiciously and with wisdom, let me say. Okay, with that, let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great exposition of what is happening in the country with regard to the Islamist parties, and thank you for sharing that. Maniza?
Oh, wow, no pressure following that presentation and changing the subject. I'm going to take a turn towards the youth movement because I think we should give some more focus on the Shahbag action that we saw earlier this year, and also foreign policy, a little bit of the regional balance. I would say that there's no doubt that there are similarities between the Shahbag movement that we saw in Bangladesh with what we see in Turkey or in Cairo or in Brazil, for that matter. These are all social media-empowered youth movements across the globe. A pattern of flash mobilization that's persistent with protests and repeat themselves. However, there are some important differences. For instance, the Shahbag protesters were probably the only one of all of these movements that were demanding more authority and harder action from the government. Everywhere else, for instance, in Cairo or in Turkey, the protests are against the authority of the government. So the demands of the Shahbag movement were asking for death penalty, where the war crimes tribunals had given Qadir Mullah a life sentence. So they started as allegedly for leniency, but also the Shahbag movement's demands were not sustained. And let's look into the details of the elements of the Bangladeshi politics. The Shahbag movement, most importantly, was leaderless. While there were certain youths that took part and occupied the stage for moments, there was really no one individual that the crowds were circling around. Shahbag also really reflects a very polarized view of Bangladeshi society, whereas Shahbag youth were mostly urbanized middle class or aspiring middle class, English speaking and educated. We also saw soon after that the movement by the Hifazat, which was mostly rural, less affluent, probably Bangla speaking and madrasa educated. The third thing that we see in the Shahbag movement was the theme of the Bangladesh Liberation War. They all highlighted a very united narrative of Bangladesh. So the three main aspects of the Shahbag movement are that they're leaderless, that it was polarized, or it reflected a polarized view of the society, and that it invoked the Liberation War. And although Shahbag was leaderless, it was not anti-government, and effectively, potentially an asset for the Awami League. Here, if the BNP is to succeed, it should strategically present itself as a centrist party, or like a sane middle ground between the Jamaat and the Hifazat versus the Awami League and the Shahbag. What we have in Shahbag is an indication that there's a new generation of Awami League supporters ready for the Awami League to reinstate itself as a mass movement. Currently, there isn't that much difference between the Awami League and the BNP because both of them are backed by major business houses. So Shahbag could represent, or would have represented, a huge asset for the Awami League. What's happening, I think, in Bangladesh, as Dr. Riaz really highlighted, is that we're at risk of losing our common narrative, common national narrative. For more than a generation, we've always been taught that Bengalis were repressed people, then they were mistreated, but they uprose and liberated themselves and from West Pakistan and came with their own nation. Today, this narrative is being torn apart, however, because there are parallel identities, which, again, Dr. Riaz highlighted, the Bengali identity versus the Muslim identity, each being under threat. And if there's no common narrative, then Bangladesh is being torn with civil strife. I'm just going to quickly move on because I need to get home because I'm sure the questions will be more interesting than the rest of my presentation. But in the region, India needs Bangladesh to be a robust society and a state allied with New Delhi. Most importantly, for India's internal insurance, India does not want to be demonized in Bangladesh, and it can better do so by reaching out to both political parties, in particular the BNP. When India does not play fair between Bangladesh's political parties, the BNP reaches out to China to balance the presence of India, it seems. So the BNP is more likely to invest in its relationship with India as Pakistan is no longer a competitor. And because China is already in Myanmar next door, it is already also present economically in Bangladesh, but will do so more and more politically. Therefore, it would be good to see the Indians become partners in a peer-to-peer relationship in order to avoid Bangladesh reaching out to Pakistan, the USA, which is the ultimate balance, of course, but currently not as interested. And then the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is remote and not as interested. And finally to China. So the bottom line is that India cannot treat Bangladesh as a protectorate, or it will risk Bangladesh reaching more and more out to China. To do so, it would have to show more flexibility in the concessions and the agreements that the Awami League has sought. For example, in the transit agreement that we sought, Hasina went to New Delhi, but when she returned, even her close ministers did not know the details of the agreements that were made. This not only affected her credibility, but also as her image as an independent leader. So it would be good if the Indians would reach out to non-Awami League players with more credibility and focus on it and do it properly. Finally, currently the U.S. is not as engaged as Bangladesh would like it to be, as it has withdrawn, I would say, pretty much globally. But this is not, I don't think this is a permanent position. Therefore, there is bound to be a correction for this withdrawal, but the U.S. would have to be more involved. Bangladeshi parties seeking to establish this balance in the international relations ought to remain conscious of this fact that this is probably temporary and not assume that the U.S.'s withdrawal is permanent. Therefore, I would say it's best that the Bangladeshis not get too involved with China in order to balance our power play with India. And that's going to wrap up my talk.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to open it to questions. I just ask that you raise your hand, wait for the microphone, state who you are, and try to keep it to a question. So I see we have several questions. I'm going to start at the back. The gentleman in the red.
Thank you, Dr. Agiraj. When I saw your name, I decided to come here. I'm a assistant professor of statistics in University of Chittagong. I submitted my PhD in statistics at George Washington University. So I like Mr. Reza's one comments that he made, like Islamic politics and the trial of the one criminal are two different things. So here is my point. Now, this is also information for Dr. Alisa, because the present Prime Minister, she arranged an arranged marriage between her daughter and the son of a notorious war criminal. And that notorious war criminal is now a cabinet member of our political room. And besides these two other members of the cabinet member in our society, so present government is now targeting only the opposition political parties for the trial of the war criminal.
Do you have
so
a question?
My question is this: do you think present government desperately want a free, fair trial of the war criminal, or just want to trial, or just want to punish the opposition political parties? I can seek Alisa. Dr. Alisa, I respect you. I can pronounce at least 7 names of the Awami League Presidium body as well as their cabinet. Those are directly involved in during war criminal.
Okay,
and the
thank
most
you.
notorious war criminal, just one minute, most notorious war criminal in the human of Bangladesh history is the Faizul Haq, the son of Shere Bangla A.K. Fazlul Haq. And he was appointed state minister for textile by this Sheikh Hasina, our prime minister. But now the question is, why they are targeting all the war criminals from opposition political party? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can see the passion in this issue. Yeah.
Do you want to say a few words, or let
I think it was
Dr.
really
Riaz?
you.
Okay.
Arranged marriage between the son of a war criminal and her daughter, our prime minister.
I got your
Arranged
point.
marriage.
Thank you. Let me correct my name first. My name is Riaz. But anyway, the point you are making, I understand where you're coming from. The point is, who is...
I also know where you are coming from. You cannot target me in open discussion.
Excuse me. Let him answer the question.
No, I'm saying I understand where you're coming from. I'm trying to understand your arguments. This is a phrase, this is an expression. Don't take it personally. I'm not suggesting anything as to where you are coming from means which political party you represent. I do not carry anyone's water, and I don't think anyone should. So, to the point that whether it is targeted only against opposition, justice in this kind of case is transitional justice. As you can see, it is a process that is starting. And you cannot and should not, and for that matter, I would not suggest that this government should end the trial just by identifying this number of people who have been identified and tried at this point. There's a larger process to it, and it should have been followed previously, and it should be followed subsequently, even if the government is, if the present political party is not in the power. That's why my suggestion is, as has always been, since the process started, that there should be not only a temporary measure in regard to this. The process should be continued, and if there are other elements in the society, and which I'm sure there will be identified, should be tried. Anyone who has committed, if you look at my statement, sir, what did I say? I said anyone who has committed heinous crimes, such as crimes against humanity, should be tried. And this is not only in case of Bangladesh. I take that stand in regard to Rwanda. I take that stand in regard to Cambodia. I take that stand in regard to Bangladesh. I have no problem with I have no preference as to who should be tried. My point is, anyone who has committed, and perhaps this is the 4th time I'm saying, so that this video, when it's posted, everyone can make it very clear. Anyone who has committed heinous crimes and crimes against humanity and been participated in genocide should be tried.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Let's come down here. one of our previous panelists.
Hi, Shamaruk Mohiuddin with USBAC. I have a question regarding how to deal with Jamaat. You mentioned, a couple of you, that they're facing an existential threat. At the same time, even though Shahbag was leaderless, there was a plea to ban Jamaat, and it seemed like it was being heeded well in some quarters, especially in the government. And the rationale that was given was that for banning Jamaat is that you don't let the Nazi Party operate in Germany, for instance. So I would like you to talk about the merits and pitfalls of banning a party like that. I think it's a very complex issue. So if you could just talk about both sides.
Okay. Who wants to? Would you like to?
I think this is a question that speaks to Bangladesh's domestic political environment. We certainly maintain contact with all parties, with opposition parties. Jamaat is part of the opposition, and we continue to maintain contact with them. But as for a domestic view, I would turn to our other colleagues.
Want to take a stab at this?
Not at all.
Okay. So I'm on the spot again. Banning Jamaat-e-Islami under the present constitution is not possible because of its Islamist politics. Meaning that, let me rephrase the statement. Just because Jamaat-e-Islami is an Islamist political party, Bangladesh constitution as it stands would not allow the government to ban it. Period. That's a simple statement. Had it been in 1972, it would have been possible. After the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment was, when the court said the Fifth Amendment is gone, when the Constitution for a moment was there, it could have been done. But currently, under the present Constitution after 15th Amendment, it cannot be done because of that. That does not mean that it does not allow, if any political party or any individual has been involved in this kind of crime, it does not prevent them to try them. How Jamaat-e-Islami should be treated is a political question. It is not a legal question to my understanding. It is a political question. And that political question needs to be understood and addressed to within the broader framework of Bangladesh politics, where Bangladesh wants to go and whether there is a consensus and agreement in regard to the ideals. It is not presently, which Maniza has mentioned, that there's a continuous struggle within that. So with that, the issue of Jamaat-e-Islami's trial is, currently there is one court case going on. I understand that whether it should be a registered political party. That itself doesn't address that issue either, because you can be a political party not registered with Election Commission. That doesn't stop you from forming a political party. So if Jamaat-e-Islami, if the court can actually determine that Jamaat-e-Islami as an organization was involved in crimes against humanity, then as it happened in case of Nuremberg trial, and let me remind everybody, the Nuremberg trial, now that we see it as a standard, was very controversial at the time. Even the US Attorney General, I guess, was not very happy with that. So if through the legal process, if any organization is established to have definitely been involved in any of these crimes against humanity, that's a different issue altogether. Okay?
Okay, thank you. This gentleman right here in the middle.
My name is Jawal Islam. I'm Bangladeshi American. I did masters in history and minor in political science, and I did masters here in computer information system. So thank you for both panel and especially Ambassador Kudus. I got lots of information, and I will need maybe a few weeks. Sorry, Ambassador Kader. I will need a few weeks to digest it because I have flavor, computer science, history, and political science. So as a Bangladeshi American, actually we dream Bangladesh every single day. Every single day. And sometimes we're shocked and surprised, especially there was on news, TIB, Transparent International, day before yesterday, that Bangladesh has always this at the bottom of the list, and three sectors, which is judiciary, police, and another one. What's the last? Political parties. So Bangladesh is so behind in the judiciary system, police department, and political system. So if these three departments corrupted, and how we can expect the fair trial like ICT and Dr. Alisa, as you mentioned, that Stephen Reff had recommended a few times and several areas, but those did not address up to now. Not, I'm saying not at all, but there are many, many recommendations did not address yet. And also, I like to mention that Bangladesh jail, the capacity now currently in prisoners is 3 times. And since this is on TIB report that the judiciary department is corrupted department, so how as a Bangladeshi citizen can expect the fair trial, including ICT, while the Chief Justice of Tribunal 1 was resigned because of Skype, Skype violation, and he did consult with somebody in Belgium. So thank you so much.
There are sort of 10 questions in one.
Yeah, right. I think the main question was how can the War Crimes Tribunal be trusted if there are so many problems or so many issues? And I think,
Can I just offer one thought? You mentioned the challenges in governance and in policing and law enforcement, and I actually would like to address that because these are very important areas of growing cooperation between the United States and Bangladesh. We are pretty deeply engaged with Bangladesh. We have a police training program going on in the National Police Academy up in Rajshahi. I've personally visited there. There is a terrific cooperation between the Oregon State Police. They have police from Oregon who go out to Rajshahi and provide on-the-spot training. We have another area of training going on that's focused on methods of community policing, which is a different type of engagement with the community around you. So that is another area of cooperation. Through our Department of Justice, we have another kind of capacity building project underway focused on building an internal investigation capacity for the RAB, again, something that is in the government of Bangladesh's view and certainly ours, something that could be of great benefit to citizens. So these are areas of primary importance where we're going to continue to engage, and we're providing the assistance and the technical capacity to do more in Bangladesh. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that and that we continue to see this as a high priority.
How about one more question? Tim? Oh, did you want to say?
No, I mean someone was.
I'll wait my turn.
Okay, so we'll take 2, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. So first here.
Dr. Ahrens, I interviewed Mike Elk with Finley's Times Magazine. I interviewed George Miller earlier this month, last month, about the State Department's efforts, and he said that the State Department is heavily involved in the Bipartisan Policy Center and some of its discussions and some of the facilitations and attending these, while the Labor Department is not, and that, quite frankly, he didn't think the State Department was taking it too seriously. What happened with Rana Plaza? What is going to be required for GPS for them to get it back?
GSP.
GSP. What is going to be required? Is there going to be another kind of self-compliance thing like Gap and Walmart are floating now, or is it going to be along the lines what the Europeans agreed to?
Okay.
So
why don't
this
we?
Is off topic, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, you want to take it real quick, and then we'll get the last
If I could just address quickly, I mean, some of us participated in the initial open panel discussions that the Bipartisan Policy Center did launch. There was a large gathering. Ambassador Khader was there. I was there as well. USTR was there. I think there was a beginning, opening series of questions and answers and discussion. And then I think that what happened over the course of the next month was really the companies working together. So it wasn't a government effort. We have just gotten a copy of the Alliance and look forward to reading it and learning more about it. As I mentioned earlier, obviously we think it's important that all efforts that are focused on developing a coordination on workplace safety, whether that's EU, ILO, industry groups, and the brands working together to increase workplace safety, we applaud that kind of work. So then, what was your other question? On GSP.
Is there going to be a bottom line that there has to be third-party
Well,
binding arbitration?
I would certainly recommend, since you're a reporter and you're looking for a government statement on this, the U.S. Trade Representative is our lead agency that focuses on GSP. And so if you're doing something for a story, I'd highly recommend that you reach out to USTR and talk with them specifically. But we have a government-to-government channel that we talk with the government of Bangladesh, and we'll continue to work with them in talking about ways that they can make some improvements in workplace safety issues and labor issues.
But just third-party arbitration, like the European Accord is going to be in there?
Why don't we move on?
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty specific.
Yeah. Dodge a question.
Well, I know they didn't talk about it in the first panel too much, but I know that the Bangladeshi government is getting ready to release some new legislation dealing with some of these issues. So that may factor into the decision-making process as well, but I'm sure there are several different aspects that they'll be looking at. I want to have just one last question. I know there are other questions. Maybe you can come up to the panel afterwards, but this will be our final question.
My name is Akhtar Mahmood. I'm one of the members of the Bangladeshi diaspora here, and is in that capacity. I've always been curious as to why we keep referring to Bangladesh as a Muslim democracy when we don't call India a Hindu democracy or the US a Christian democracy. It's a democracy or an aspiring democracy of 160 million people, period. I mean, that's why I think the Western world should be interested in Bangladesh. And that is why I think when there are discussions of the politics of Bangladesh, yes, there could be some part of the discussion devoted to the sort of the religious, the Islamic strand in politics. But that, I think, distracts us from the much more fundamental strands in politics, which, as Ali Riaz was probably hinting at, doesn't necessarily have that much to do with religion. And I think this just distracts us from the more fundamental issues of how the mainstream political parties operate, to what extent they're aligned with the people, as Maniza was suggesting, perhaps in the context of Shahbag. Unlike the language movement many, many years ago, what started as a youth movement was not necessarily picked up by the political parties. So the disconnect between the aspirations of the people and the mainstream political parties, I think that should be something of interest even to a Western audience, given that it's a 160 million people country.
Okay, any final comments from the panelists on why we say Muslim democracy? Should we, shouldn't we?
I think I said Muslim majority nation. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Well, anyway, I think we have ferreted through numerous issues. We've just begun to touch the surface, so hopefully we'll continue this discussion into the future because these are very important issues. Bangladesh is an important country, and I appreciate you all staying through the second panel. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our panelists.